All right, hi everyone and welcome to this session, What Gets Measured Gets Managed, Making Better Use of Data in Managing Micromobility Systems. This is the last session of our conference, so congratulations to everyone for making it here. As you're all joining, I'd just like to make a few announcements. After this session, we'll have a break before our closing social. Our public forum is a great place to discuss your conference session takeaways with fellow attendees, so hop on over for a few minutes during the break. And before that closing social to share what you've learned so far. And don't forget to visit the expo as well on your break, where you can engage with our exhibitors and even earn points by your engagement. So check out the game tab to see all about earning points. If you're sharing conference highlights on Twitter, use the hashtag NABSA2020 to keep us in the loop. Now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, Stephanie Brody, to get us started.
Ariana. We're going to have 3 talks today, short talks, and then we'll be joining together to have more of a conversation. So we're looking forward to answering some of your questions in that. So we're going to start off with Sid. You can go to the next slide, Ariana. Sid is a doctoral student in transportation engineering at George Washington University. His primary research emphasizes the user behavior studies and policy design practices of shared micromobility services. Prior to joining George Mason, Sid worked as an independent consultant and has over 4 years of experience in engineering infrastructure and infrastructure development projects. Sid, take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. First of all, a huge shout out to Zoe Kirkos from People for Bikes and Sam Hare from NABSA for offering me this scholarship to be here in this conference. I was waiting to get into this conference from last year, but I'm lucky this time. And I am also presenting. So that's another thing to be very happy about. And as the first speaker of the panel, I will throw some light on the ongoing research at the George Mason University, which takes policy harmonization as a concept and evaluates its benefits and drawbacks when we apply it to the micromobility, especially the increasingly popular e-scooter systems. So this study was done under the guidance of Professor Jonathan Gifford at the Schar School of Policy and Government. So I've seen a lot of people who are participating in this conference right now must have been contacted by some of my graduate students who worked on this project, especially some of the practitioners like Paul DeMaio and Katie Monroe. So thank you so much for contributing for this study. So here are some of the findings from our study. Next slide, please. So within a couple of years from the introduction, e-scooters actually they grabbed a really good user chunk of market. So they have their own set of users. We have conducted a survey last year, and we found that the users of these electric scooters are actually somewhat different from these regular bike sharing users or the e-bike sharing users because of their trip lengths and then their behavior. While the bike sharing users tend to be mostly commuters, e-scooter users were mostly observed to be fun and joyriding, but this survey was done in the mid or the late of 2019. So we found that this might have changed because of the pandemic. And the recent studies, what we have found is that, especially a recent report by McKinsey, they were indicating that the initial average trip length was between about 1.5 miles or something around 2 miles. But now they're expecting that this average trip length to be increasing and for a need for the commuter trips by the micromobility systems itself. So that's something that we were actually looking into. So the user demand definitely actually dropped when we compare to the pandemic, pre-pandemic situation, but we don't know how much it did actually. But with these pre-existing conditions of these shared e-scooter operators were already suffering from low unit economics. This pandemic did not really do a lot good for them, but now we see subtle signs of their rise. So operators started consolidating their businesses much higher rate than before. So for example, we've seen Uber and Lime, we have seen Bird Scooters, we have seen Zaxter and Super Pedestrian combination right now. So these are all happening in a really fast pace. And there's never been a better time to actually analyze how people are moving forward in their daily trips and to understand what cities can do to actually address how to make these trips better and user experience better. So Due to this pandemic, what we've observed is the economies of scale have been impacted greatly because of, as we know that there are two different parts to these economies of scale. One is internal economies of scale and the external economies of scale. While the internal economy of scale can be managed by these operators itself, the external economies of scale are widely depending upon the users and also the government and the policies that were designed. So we will look into what can cities do in terms of making these services better and to offer a second chance for these electric scooters to come back to what they were in the 2019. Next slide, please. So that we have looked into 12 neighboring jurisdictions, actually 13. So this is a map of all the jurisdictions that we have visited. So the reason why we chose these areas is because they have a commonality in terms of shared borders. So Santa Monica and Los Angeles, and we have Arlington County, we have Alexandria, and then we have DC. We also have two other cities in California, which is Oakland and Berkeley, Miami and Coral Gables. And we also have Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Fairfax County and City of Fairfax. Fairfax County did not really have, by the time we were doing the study, Fairfax did not have any scooters deployed on the streets, but they had a policy which was passed and they were actually anticipating to put the vehicles on the ground. So we analyzed different key factors that were accounted into these policy ordinances. And what we found is that device specifications broadly, they were adopted by these neighboring jurisdictions in the same manner. If they are from the same state, they have the same device specifications. So these device specifications are mostly like, we have the speed governors, bell, tail lamps, and onboard GPS, and some of the other standards. And most of these were actually followed in common by, as mentioned by the state mandated issues. But we have other parts like right-of-way specifications and then the safety standards, which are widely varying between the local jurisdictions. For example, we have Minneapolis, which requires users to dismount from their electric scooters if they're taking a left turn, but they don't have the same facility or the same rule in the St. Paul. So that's something to note for. And similarly about the data sharing standards too. So the public API feeds were not available widely in all the neighboring jurisdictions. We found that the geofencing is also not common. In the same example, Minneapolis has no geofencing. So users can actually take the scooter, they can go cross the border into the St. Paul, but the only condition is the scooter cannot be started again until it was returned back to the jurisdiction of Minneapolis. So we have operator selection, which is one more important factor here to account for. Even if the cities are from the same neighboring jurisdictions, they do not have the same way of choosing the operators. And this depends upon how they decide and how they make their decision by rating the operators. This is called as decision-making scorecards that we've observed. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about it in the next slides. Next slide, please. So some of the critical factors, what we've observed is the governance model of the jurisdiction. So we have something called as Dillon's rule, and we have home rule and a hybrid rule. So as of this study, when we were doing this study, we found like there are 32 states which have like everything in home rule, but they have a hybrid model too. So they have certain cities which will be implementing home rule and other cities will be implementing Dillon's rule. They are called as charter cities. So our study included most cities from the home rule, but we have some cities in Virginia, whatever cities we have collected from there, the data, they are from the Dillon's rule. So what we observed is that cities from the Dillon's rule, they have a commonality in the way that they're implementing their policies. There is some kind of a convergence. For example, Arlington County and Alexandria, they're making some attempts to actually collaborate and do this and implement this micromobility policies together. And we found that the geographical context is one more thing that is quite important. BCG mentioned in their research that the mid-sized cities like Austin and Lisbon, they are like, and San Diego, they're all like considered as a scooter paradise. So such smaller cities will have a shared borders with the neighboring jurisdictions are more suitable for this case of the harmonization of these policies. So when we talk about the decision scorecards, neighboring jurisdictions with the similar policies, they are found to have like dissimilar operators due to this decision-making criteria. So for example, City of Oakland has 10 shared mobility principles by which they decide which operator is gonna be selected into this program. And similarly, Arlington has adopted San Francisco's model. They also had 10 different principles through which they're going to rate individual operator. And if they qualify at least by scoring by 70 points out of 100 points, then they have a chance to be given a permit. But Washington, D.C., in the other case, they have done a hybrid of both Oakland and the Arlington County, and they have gone with 8 different weighted criteria, which range from about 21% for the accountability and all the way to 3% to the sound equipment design. Next slide, please. So why do we even have to consider harmonization? That's the biggest question here. So the reason is we found that in some of the like very little data that we had, we do some kind of a spatiotemporal pattern analysis. We found like several trips in the Washington, D.C., and also 10% of the trips that either originate or end in Arlington County, they originate outside the city jurisdiction. So that's actually a problem. A problem is a problem no matter how big or small it is. So we thought of addressing it and see what cities can do. And the other part is we have to ensure that users have this consistency of information. If a person travels from one jurisdiction to the other jurisdiction, or if there's an increase in the triple N, they wanted to take an e-bike and wanted to move to the other city, they cannot take it because cities have disparate policies in terms of disabling the equipment itself, or they have they levy fines on the operators, or the users do not know whether to operate on the sidewalk or not on the sidewalk, whether they have a requirement. So there are several other factors that are coming into the picture. So one of the other most important parts is harmonization has a great impact on future mobility policies of especially mobility as a service, because there is no sharing of data between the neighboring jurisdictions. There is no mass, because integrating the transportation services has become one of the biggest issue. So, and next slide, please. So harmonization, we have seen that it has been implemented at different levels. From the history that we have known, we have the seatbelt regulation, and we have seen what Uber has done by trying to preempt the cities from actually getting access to their data. That is one of the biggest problem. You cannot, if we preempt the cities from having access to this data, they cannot regulate these services at the city level and address the core problems of the city itself. So cities need to have some kind of freedom in terms of regulating these services. So we cannot preempt these micromobility services at the state level either. But there are other examples like Capital Bike Share, which is like a combination. It's a decentralized approach, but also a combination of 6 different jurisdictions, their neighboring jurisdictions. They came together and they implement the same bike sharing system, which is a huge success, but they are also operating this at a decentralized level. So there's another example where Boston MAPC has gone for it by doing a collaboration between 15 neighboring jurisdictions, and they've implemented Lime dockless bike sharing system to see how users travel within and outside the jurisdictions. So next slide, please. So some of the things to consider is how inclined cities are towards these kind of policies and whether they are inclined to collaborate or not. If they feel like one hand is tied back and they do not have this ability to make these policies and that don't have the freedom to take the policies, that's one of the barriers for it. And we have another implementation part is that this does not have to be an all or nothing process, because there is no one-step solution for all the policy making between all the cities. This is supposed to be tailored, and cities need to come together in order to decide what can be measured and what can be done to collaborate in terms of sharing their data. So next slide, please. So I quickly ran through the slides, but I gave you the gist of the study, and these are the collaborators of the study, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. That was a great overview of policies that are based on data that cities are taking in from micromobility providers. Next, we'll have Elliot, and he will talk to us about some of the data that is being used and how it's being used. Elliot manages mobility partnerships at Populous. He has worked as a consultant to bring data-driven decision-making approaches to cities throughout the Pacific Northwest, identifying data sources and bringing stakeholder groups to consensus on appropriate metrics to monitor and to determine project outcome success. Take it away, Elliot.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks, Sid. That was a great starter. As mentioned, yes, my name is Elliot Muting, and I work for a company called Populous. I think we talk a little bit more about it in the next slide, please. Thank you. So yes, we at Populous, we are a data processor and aggregator. We help cities both do better planning and compliance when it comes to micromobility and other forms of transit. We essentially help cities by ingesting data feeds from operators so that they can have an insight into the operations of operators on their streets, where the vehicles are, where they're going, and how they ought to be managed. We're a relatively new company that has sort of been birthed out of this wave of new mobility options that have been flooding city streets. And as cities and DOTs in particular are charged with managing ever more complex ecosystems of options for ways to get around in a city, we are providing that safe space for them to, a sandbox, if you will, to ingest data from all the different operators and view it all in a single and harmonized way. We're doing this now in over 80 cities around the world. We'll have to update this, these materials. And yeah, I'm excited to participate in the rest of this panel discussion. But before we go to the discussion portion, I think we have a couple other slides here that discuss the types of ways cities use data to measure operations. So get the next slide, please. Thank you. So you can imagine yourself in the position of a city transportation official who's been charged with managing a new micromobility program on the city streets. It's most likely the first time that your city has received shared mobility in any sense, and so it'll be uncharted territory. And like with anything, especially when a city does something, if it's something new and something that could be flashy, like some of the e-scooters are, it's going to be politically controversial. And so when this new task is landed on your plate, you have to ask yourself, you know, what is it that I need to know to make sure that this program goes off well and it's well received by not only the community at large, but also by the elected officials who will ultimately have to answer to that very same community. So some of the simple questions, or the more basic ones that cities may have are, you know, how many vehicles are there on my streets? It turns out that this can actually be a quasi philosophical question. You know, how many vehicles are on my streets? How many shared vehicles are on my streets can get down to some pretty interesting questions of, you know, how many of what type of vehicles, right? How many of what vehicles in which state? How many available vehicles do I have on my streets? How many non-operational vehicles do I have on my streets? How many people are currently riding a vehicle on my streets? And so one of the basic things that Populous does is actually help cities count and enforce the idea of a vehicle cap, right? Many cities, when they permit these micromobility operators to begin service on their streets, hold those operators accountable for not deploying over a certain amount of scooters. So using a tool like Populous, cities can ingest those data streams from operators and get a view into how many vehicles are on their streets throughout the day and make sure that they are beholden to that. So you can see through this screenshot we have here, the dotted red line would be the vehicle cap, which looks like for this municipality had been around 250, and it takes some time for some of the operators to come into compliance. That's some of the more basic items that a city may want to measure. Next slide, please. Thank you. But some of the things that cities want to measure with data can actually get fairly complex. Some of these instances are many cities are adopting distribution requirements. So essentially regulations monitoring these operators for the concentration of their vehicles throughout different parts of the city. So you could imagine some cities want to know or have requirements around, they'll divide up their city into different zones, and they'll say that because we want to make sure our scooter program is a success, we want to make sure that these scooters are available in all these zones, but not oversaturated. And so some of the distribution requirements we see are, throughout our deployment zones or throughout the service area that we've cut up into zones, we never want to see less than 5% of the total fleet within that zone. And we also never want to see more than 25% of the total fleet in that zone. So some of these measurements can get a bit more complex. Additionally, we also see lots of cities beginning to implement different equity areas. So these can be done in a couple of different ways, but essentially from the city's point of view, they want to make sure that certain portions of the population of their city are essentially guaranteed access to these vehicles at any given time. These can either be very tailored instances, like specific street intersections or specific deployment zones that are much more tailored to the exact street corner, or they could be more generalized, like the previous example I gave of just various distribution requirements at a zone level. Like, so at a neighborhood level, they want to make sure that they always have a certain percentage of the fleet in a certain area. But these are some of the more complex ways that cities are using the data to hold these scooter operators accountable for meeting the city's goals of the program, right? More often than not, when a city has agreed to allow these vehicles on their street, it's because it aligns with some of their own internal goals. And to make sure that those operators actually fulfill the same goals that were intended by allowing this program to go forward, they'll need to be measuring the operations either at a basic level or in this more complex and precise way. Next slide, please. Great. So beyond just spatial requirements and the number of vehicles on a street, many cities want to know whether or not the vehicles are being used. And so one of the best ways to do that is through a metric of utilization. So essentially the number of rides per vehicle per day. From the DOT or the city's perspective, because I'm allowing these vehicles to be on our streets and be parked on our sidewalks and move in our bike lanes, essentially adding a bunch more objects in the public right-of-way, you want to make sure that they're actually being used for the purpose of getting people around and not just merely obstructions or potentially projectiles or worse, right? So one of the ways you can do that is by measuring the utilization rate. Occasionally, cities will actually tie other performance metrics of these operators to the utilization rate. So you can imagine a city saying, from our previous example, we only want to allow 250 vehicles per operator on our streets at any given time, because we don't want to have more than, say, 1,000 vehicles on our streets at a time. However, if you, operator, are showing that you are better at managing your fleet and thus getting more rides per vehicle than some of the other operators, we want to encourage that, because we want to have vehicles on the street that are being used. And so we do see in many cases where operators are actually allowed to unlock higher vehicle thresholds for how many vehicles they can have deployed based on their utilization rates. Next slide, please. Great. So as I mentioned at the outset, many cities use our services of data aggregation and processing to both do compliance for the operators in terms of them meeting their permits, the permit requirements, but they also want to plan, right? As we mentioned at the outset, like the position that the city DOT official is in to make sure that this program is a success, because essentially by allowing a new service, the city is taking a risk, right? I think the easiest state for many cities is to not do something new. So anytime you take something new on, there's additional, more onerous requirements to make sure that it goes correctly. And so part of what some cities are doing is looking at operations data, such as parking data. This heat map on the top shows parking events throughout Arlington. And when they see where people are ending their trips, and if there's ever a high concentration of vehicles being left in certain areas of the city, they may want to begin dedicating space within the public right-of-way for those vehicles to be parked, thus reducing some of the sidewalk clutter and some of the standard objections that people have to allowing these vehicles onto their streets. So with operations data, being able to visualize where all parking events are happening, essentially where scooters are accumulating, city officials can make decisions and actually support those decisions with data when it comes to working with their public works department or whomever else they need to make sure that some work gets done in the street to carve out a space for shared mobility, so that they don't have some of those externalities weighing on the folks who don't use them. Next slide, please. Further, in the planning sort of aspect of the data that cities do is they often want to see where all these vehicles are going. You know, which streets are accommodating travel by the users of these services. Often, cities don't have a great count for where people are traveling on vehicles that aren't cars because they're simply harder to count. And so shared micro-mobility devices actually provide a great insight into how people travel throughout a city via alternative means. So we see often cities utilizing data from micromobility operators aggregated to the street level to see where the flow of these vehicles are going, to do some analysis on their bike master plans, or also see the impact of rider behavior pre and post some sort of intervention in the public right-of-way, such as a road diet or implementing a car-free street. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to getting a holistic view of how these services are impacting cities, not everything can actually be gleaned just from data alone. And we find that often to get a full picture of how these services are being received in cities, it's very helpful to often ask people the old-fashioned way. How are you using these services? Do you like them? What do you use them for, etc.? And so Populous has made it our business to ensure that we not only provide cities with insights into the operational data, but we also aid in the design and deployment of surveys of both the users and the city population at large for how these services are impacting their life and what they're using the services for. Next slide, please. Right, so some new opportunities that we see coming from data analysis and surveys both. Given that we are in a global pandemic and we're all sitting here participating in this conference virtually, I just noticed I'm actually holding my NAPSA pen from the conference I attended last year when we were all in person. But this is all to say that, you know, the world has changed pretty rapidly over the last 9 months, and the world of transportation planning is no different. More and more cities are undertaking new and innovative means to try to keep up with what's going on in the world, whether that be closing streets to allow for people to have additional space to recreate outside without fear of being interacting with a motor vehicle, or if it's closing down certain parking lanes to allow for restaurants to continue their business outside. There are ways in which we can see the impacts of those decisions reflected in micromobility data, and we would just encourage any and all additional measuring points we can use to help better understand the impacts these decisions are having on our cities. Next slide. I think that's, yeah, I'm looking forward to the panel discussion with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. Really appreciate you showing us some ways that populous cities make decisions. So we'll wrap up here for our presentations with Zafiro. And we'll be talking about the rich data set that you guys are using which will be our host next year. So Zafiro is a Mexican consultant and researcher with a background in sociology and public policy. She has a diploma in foreign policy and international relations of local governments and public policies on gender, equality, and human rights, and experience in coordination of studies and social projects. Since 2013, she has been a researcher and founder of Calliope SC, a consultancy focused on research, planning, and the development with multidisciplinary performance.
Hello, thank you for the invitation again. Thanks to Samantha and Stephanie, all the team. So I'm gonna begin, I'm gonna share my screen. I just would like to have a confirmation that you're watching my screen. Okay, thanks. So we received this invitation, really pleased to share this because we have this consultancy firm since 2013. We just got 7 years in August. We're really happy about it. And since we began, we had this commitment that it was to bring information and to be also making projects according to the things we believe in. So for us, it's really important to have information and data. So in Mexico, I mean, we need to context everything because it's so different from the States. Even so, like last year, we were in Indianapolis in the last NAFSA meeting, and it was so great to see how people is doing things and what differences we have, not only about the incomes or the kind of politics we're reaching, but also with people that we are trying to do the same, right? To have better lives and better environments, better projects. So for us, it's really important to share this today. So so in a context we are in Guadalajara. It is one of the biggest cities in Mexico. We also have this metropolitan area, and according to data, we are a little bit more than 8 million people, so it is a big, big city. Mivisi, this is a bike share system we have, and we need to say something about it because it is a great project, but it's different from what you are running in different countries, because at this moment, what we know is that Mivisi, it is a governmental project. It runs with public money, and we have a fee that is something symbolic. I didn't change it into dollars, but it's really, really cheap. I mean, it's something really affordable for most of people, like a big majority. And it runs since 2014, and it has a lot of trips, more than 13,500 trips. So it is a big project, it is growing, and also the infrastructure we have in the city is growing with this new governmental administration. So those are some highlights we have about the context. And also, I bring this out because last year, it was such a surprise for me to find out that the different systems you have in other cities, other countries, is quite different, because you have more like a business, and this is run by a company that is a private company giving the service. So it is the operator. The operator here is run by BKT, that's the team. And okay, so we began with this first glimpse, I think it was in 2016, where we had this commitment with this company called BKT, that they were really open to listen to our studies or to the work we were doing in Calliope. So we find out that the users in Mivisi were growing up, and it was a really good news. But what we found out is that it's not the same for women than for men. And we had these 70% men users against 30% women. So they were open to have this first study, and we did something more in a qualitative state. And it was really good to find out some stuff. And also last year, we could find out that it's not only in Guadalajara, it's something structural and it's all around the world, except for these cities where you have really great infrastructure, it changes. And the thing is that we need to use the gender perspective to integrate it into any kind of design of the systems you are running. Why? Because if you take a look at the numbers, even so the presentation you just show up, you can see that it's not that often to see these numbers, just in two ways, right? How many women, how many men are using the systems, and what are the differences in the users? Why? Because we have social statements that are different for men and women, not only about motherhood, but in different things. And also the dangers we're running just by being women in these kind of societies. So in this first glimpse, we were really pleased to have this as a tool, right? To have this information. And also we were really pleased in Calliope that the provider of the system, BKT, it was a really open, run most of all for men, but they were really open to know about this. And they were making anything that was in charge of them to also communicate to the government, because here in a public policy view, we have different kind of actors. There's not only the user, it's also the people that are providing the system and also the government, right? And also inside the government, there are different kind of offices that you have to be talking to and trying to communicate this data to, I mean, if we also see something quite close, it is not like a big thing for most of people. Otherwise, all of us, we were doing something beyond than just running numbers and not taking a look to the differences we have between these users, only like that, men and women. So I invite you, especially to those who are running private systems, to take a look if you have the chance, because what I know is that not all time you have this kind of data, because you're only asking for your credit card number and a name. So it's something really general, and you won't have this kind of numbers or data, right? So the second step we had, it was, we run a study last year because it is a big thing for women to be in the city, to move in cities. And in Calliope, most of our team we are women. And it was kind of sad to know that most of us had suffered any kind of sexual harassment in the streets in different levels. So what we presented last year in APSA, it was a result of this survey. And we had this kind of theory about, it seems like using Mivisi, it becomes a tool to live in a different way all the sexual harassment. It decreases in different ways, not because it's a magic tool, but because it's natural. I mean, it is a way to move in an autonomy, right? You don't need anyone to move you. It's you, yourself, and the bike. And then you don't need to take care of the bike. You just leave it in any kind of station. So the conclusion we had is that Mivisi provides autonomy and freedom, which can be reflected in the decrease of touching and inappropriate approaches experiences. Mivisi is a tool to live differently the displacements in the city for women. We love this result, honestly. And what we had also is it was a great experience to share this with all of people that were presented in NAPSA last year, because what was really wonderful is all people that were reaching me after we presented this. And most of you were telling me that it was happening in your cities. You had some kind of this feeling about the number of users, yeah, of course, in the bike share system, but also as bike users in general. So we have different ways of using the systems and also in constructing the projects you're dealing with. And this year we had, well, it's something that is going on all around the world, right? Anything about COVID, that it changed everything. And the way we're living, the way we're studying, the way we're buying things, the way we move, especially. So we had this other survey that we're just finished and they're just about to present it inside into the government, into the provider, BKT. And the thing is that we find out that the use of MiBici is changing too. Why? Because we were not allowed to go out in certain months of the years between March and until June. So we know that it was something different even here in Mexico. It depended on the city where you were living, the kind of management that the government was giving to the pandemia, right? So for us, it was really good to see and like a lot of news saying that the bikes were like the new fashion, right? That it was like the stores in Germany were out of bikes because people were buying and buying bikes. So it is like a really great news. And it seems like in Guadalajara is also happening something like that. And also because there is an increased number of infrastructure to have site, I forgot the name. Well, to have protected lines for only bikers, right? And also we have a new view that is that there are, I don't know how many they are, but there are a lot of people working for the government this time, and they are so close to the activists of bikers. So it gives a completely different view. And at this moment, with the numbers we have, we are also running the different jobs and activities about the movement in the city with MiBici. And what we have is that, yeah, it's different the way we move because any kind of task you have, it's different. And most of people right now, we still have the 70 against 30%. And with all changes and having kids, because in Guadalajara or all around Mexico, we still have our kids studying home and a lot of people also working from home. So it is coming to an end eventually, because if you are out, you can see a lot of people also moving. So the numbers are changing really fast. And we're just about to release more results about this. You can also download the results from the last one we had. It is in English. We have an English version in Calliope's webpage. And there is a reflection we want to share with you, and also to put it on the table to have any kind of discussion and how we can design or how data is something profitable. Because from our side, we need any kind of contracts, right, to be making this data. But it's not that easy because not all people are engaged to see this data is going to work for them. So the good news is that we're looking and trying to reach equality. At the beginning of the first meeting yesterday, it was really cool to listen about the movements we have, the social movements we're having right now, trying to reach equality, about gender, about race, about also economy. And these kind of things need to be in the middle of the numbers, of the data we're having, because it doesn't matter if we are just naming and announcing the numbers we have about how many trips you're making, how many bikes do you have. We need to make this system, because it is a big chance to involve people and use the bike or even the scooters as tools for people to have new democracies, to have I mean, it is a political statement to have bikes instead of cars, or also to improve the way we have or transportation, right? The public transportation in Latin America is not the best what we have, and it is a big issue, it's a big problem. Also, we know, and you are proving from your teams, that having bike systems, it is a great tool. We had Fernanda from Mexico City yesterday also presenting the experience of EcoBici, and it's something that is crazy, the amount of people using the bikes. And also, the thing is that we also did the same survey that we had in Guadalajara with Mexico City, and we still have numbers that are kind of the same, right? So at the end, what we need is to have more people involved in this from different sides. I mean, the providers, even the bike, the people that is making the systems. If you're only thinking about users as a flat number, as a flat variable, it should be think twice, because the users, we are not the same. We are not the same color, we're not the same age, because it's not the same to have only a view as a user as a young guy that just finished university and earns like this amount of money that allows him to pay anything. So it is a democratical way to improve the life of people if we're just opening to have different kind of data. That includes more differences between people, because we are not the same at that moment, right? Talking about data. So in conclusion, the experience we had in Guadalajara with this wonderful system, MiBici, it's a great experience to have numbers, because we are dealing with a triple team about consultancy from us, and also from the provider, BKT, and the government. And this is a great moment for Guadalajara, because we are having this scenario to bring the data into reality. And they are taking care of gender equality in construction, of course. There is a big way around and ahead. So thank you for the invitation again.
Thank you so much, Santoro. Now I want to open it up to questions from the audience. So please feel free to use the chat box on Pathable to submit your questions. And I'll start with a couple for the panel. We talked about policies that kind of rely on data, and then how data is used to influence policy or make policy decisions. And then also some of the bigger issues that maybe are not just related to policy, but are also related to user demographics and getting people into the system. I wanted to ask you guys, what data have you found most useful to direct policy? What data have you found most useful to help decision makers in making decisions? And are there any obvious gaps that you see in that data? Go ahead, Elliot.
Sure.
Just jump into the conversation now, so.
So the data sources that we use mostly are twofold. We use the GBFS, which is the General Bike Share Feed Specification. And we also use MDS, which is the Mobility Data Specification. And both those are data streams that speak to scooter companies or micromobility operators' operations, right? Where each vehicle is it available or not? Where did it go? And so these are fairly, mechanical data points. When it comes to doing analysis of an entire scooter program or a micromobility program of any kind, a new mobility program for that matter, the mechanical data is certainly one portion. Cities have requirements of these companies when they put vehicles on their streets about how they should behave, where they should be stored, and what they're hoping for these vehicles providing to the city, right? But it doesn't always speak to, and this is some of the items that my other panelists were discussing, it doesn't always speak to who is using these vehicles and what they're being used for, and whether or not those trips by those people are supporting the goals that the cities have, right? So I'd say the data sources that we use are really good at helping cities hold operators accountable for how they keep the vehicles and where they keep the vehicles and how they're being used, but not always the best for making sure that the whole diverse set of citizens that a city has equal access to them, and whether or not those trips are being used or going to places that would be considered essential trips, or to places that these people need to go.
That's an excellent point. And the title of this panel or the session is what gets measured gets managed. So seeing as there being a gap in kind of demographic data, that is definitely something that we might want to talk about some more. And I would love to hear a little bit more from Zephyro about the ways in which you were able to start capturing that data.
Yeah, so thank you, Stephanie. Even with Elliot, that was saying about the kind of data you're giving to the operator. Like, for example, we know about all the comments or anything that is received through the systems they have, even through social network, about what happens when a bike, there's no bikes in a station and it's late and it's dark. It's not the same, right? Because you're afraid. So the complaints, because these are complaints for the operator, is different from women than men. That if you have to walk, even so the stations are 5 minutes away, one from each other, it is a completely different experience, what we know and what we feel. So the thing is that if we don't have these kind of tools, and also through the women and girls we reach in the second stage of our study, it was more a qualitative study. And we have this focus group with the users, with heavy users, young girls, 17 years old, riding bikes to go to school, super cool, but they were telling us this, right? There is no stereotype on this. If you have to walk more, you are afraid and you're in danger, like this. Not only to be robbed, but in a different kind of danger. So it was really cool to know that the operator is really sensitive about this. And it's something that is always take care. And I mean, of course the numbers are always going to tell us a view, and how is something that we can involve, right? To manage in a different way, or to improve the way we are giving the service for people. Even in an economical way, you can gain more users if you have more than half of populations out of your systems. So we use the data and also the database that MIBICI owns, because it is through the government we're running the program. You need to fill like a complete form, and I think it's also belong to any kind of insurance, because if an accident comes or something, it is not against a company, it is against the government. So we know a lot of information, but also we have protection data here, and it is a big thing. And also that they could reach, the thing is that you can also download the data. I mean, the kind of data you can reach, right? Because it's open and they have everything really structured. And it doesn't matter if you're not running surveys or focus group from outside like us, you can use it by yourself through the website they have. So it's really useful, because for as long as I know more than 4 theses that are running different students from masters or doctorates about how it's changing the city, maybe.
That's amazing. Sid, I wanted to ask you about, after your review of policies, are there policies that would rely on data that is not available? Are there any policies that would benefit from additional data sources?
Absolutely. Actually, what I was mentioning in one of the presentation slides is the same thing. I mean, there's a lot of scope for the cities to make reasonable decisions in terms of where to deploy these vehicles efficiently. And for example, like cities have a way of increasing their fleet size based on their performance. And if their vehicle utility ratio is more than 3, or sometimes some cities put at 2.8 or 3, which means essentially, if somebody's not familiar with it, it's at least a device is supposed to make at least 3 trips per day. And if that factor is known to the cities, they are going to increase the fleet size by a certain level. But if the cities know exactly on how they wanted to deploy these increased vehicles in different locations, that might be much more helpful. They are making use of this data right now, but there is some kind of a gap that is existing between the interactions between multiple modes. If there are, for suppose, the electric bikes, right now they were introduced back into the cities, and only some people know that they were introduced and some people do not know that they were introduced. And when they were introduced, the COVID-19 took over the cities, and now we don't know exactly how these bike share riderships are. So when cities are making these decisions on whom to offer these new permits to operate these vehicles, they can take into account how these operators are being consolidated, and how the smaller operators will be at a disadvantage if they're not deployed in these equity zones. So if a larger operator, for example, like let me give you an example, Lime Bikes, for example, they have a higher number of electric scooters in Washington, DC. And if a smaller company or a relatively newer company, like let's say Scoot or some other company has joined, and let's say some X, and they have deployed with the vehicles, initially city grants them about 200 to 300 vehicles as a standard. But the other operators which were present in the city from a longer time, they have an ability to deploy more than 800 or 900 vehicles because they have a longer presence and they have proved their utility ratios. So when you put the newer operating system close or the same location where the older operating system is, the probability of a person getting out of their home and finding a Lime bike is much more higher than finding a newly deployed sparsely distributed score system. So the way that the cities evaluate these new programs can be changed by considering these new operators as separate blocks, like a newer block, where it's a sandbox for these newer operators to test in these cities to understand how they're performing. And based on that, they can actually increase their fleet size rather than putting it at a disadvantage.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. I'm going to give a little bit additional information here. So there's several different ways that we can talk about using data. We can talk about it in planning, we can talk about it in more of analysis format, we can talk about it in oversight and enforcement, and we can also talk about it in operations. So the question is, operations data seems to be frequently referring to the operations of a device, either where it is, where it goes, how many there are, etc. But are firms developing unified ways to report on other types of operations data, such as the total number of repairs by type, crashes, theft or vandalism, devices that are rebalanced, etc.?
I can take a stab at this. So some of the information that we receive today through some of the data sources I already talked about, specifically MDS, does begin to tease out some of these additional factors that you just listed. And some of those I actually would consider, operational to a degree, right? Like if vehicle's been taken offline because of maintenance, you know, etc. That's all part of the operations and making sure that operators have the number of vehicles out there that they're allowed to have. Because we use MDS right now, the Mobility Data Specification, it's a data standard, I guess, without getting too far into the weeds, that's built off of status changes. And it's something that's meant to be a unifying standard for all the companies all the different operators to report data to cities in a single way, so that cities don't have to build 8 different ways, or Populous or other folks who are in the business of aggregating data, we don't have to build 8 different ways to ingest the information. And so really some of the issues that come with some of those more specific items of, you know, how often a scooter was damaged in a particular way or repaired in a particular way has to do with these companies being, you know, distributed or fractured amongst each other, right? They all have their own internal views of how they maintain their vehicles. And so when reporting to the city, a lot of these specificities get lost or obscured by the standard of the data, right? The generalization. So the most information that we're receiving right now about this sort of information for a vehicle is, we know when a vehicle has been taken offline for maintenance, we know when it's been picked up by the operator, and we know when it's been redeployed. And from those pieces, we can interpret some idea of how often scooters are being maintained. But for those more specific things, I'm not aware of a data source in which we could, you know, begin to extract some of those more finer pieces that was mentioned in the question.
Thanks, Elliot. Towards the beginning of Zafrio's presentation, you made a statement about data and information, and they are 2 different things. So we talk a lot about data and what we're collecting, but then also there's the translating that into actually information that can be useful. And I want to ask the panelists about challenges in communicating the findings from data, communicating it either to the public, to decision makers in the public sector. So I would love to hear some of your experiences with communicating the data and any challenges and how you've overcome them.
Yeah, last year what we had, it was opportunity to release the results we had in a press conference. So it was really cool to have also the engagement of the government. There is a metropolitan bureau, let's say like that. They were really open also to spread it through the social network and also to be talking about it. And you can see also the press conference, I mean, the attention we received about this subject, it was really cool that in the news, they were naming the thing and also being focused on sexual harassment, for example. And it was not only in the difference of the number of users between men and women, it was more into the sexual harassment thing. So we run the survey through the database they have. We had this link with the questions, with the questionnaire. So we send them, no? It was just like this. And we received like, it was a good sample, and it was more than 500, I guess. I don't have the number right now, but it was really, it was a good number. And more than 90% of users, of female users, it was only sent for women. And more than 90% of users had any of the, and because there are different ways of being harassed, right, on the streets. And the numbers we receive prove that, yeah, most of women are harassed by men, right? That's what happens. And the thing is that we have different scenarios for them to answer and to choose what they do and how are they reacting to these kind of things in the different ways to move, because it's different if you're in a and an Uber, for example, right? It's something we use quite as a world, around the world, as a tool to move. And it's different if you're in a transportation, a public transportation, because if you have, let's say, a short budget, you won't leave the bus if someone is on you. You will stay because you need to get to your job, get to your school, and you need to be next to your harasser, right? So that's what happens. And what happened after that is that there are some collectives here, some activists also, they are more than 10 years old, working in the city, also like teaching women, like especially women, how to ride a bike, because that's also a cultural thing all around the world, that they are not teaching girls how to ride bikes. So at the end is that you have young adults, young women adults, that they don't know how to ride a bike because they were never taught, because it was not necessary. I don't know. It is like a cultural construction about how women are more delicate and weak against women. But at the end is that we have a tool, right? And we want that tool. And with data, we are proving this. And also you can see more women using the bikes, and it has an effect on how all different women are also inviting more women to use the bike as the way to move. And for the government, I was talking about this nice moment, this good moment we have in Jalisco, that's the name of the state here, that there are a lot of young people running into politics, and they are on a bike. So I think they are giving a good example of how to use and how to make a statement by itself, right? And also to achieve, to have budget to construct a good city, a safe city for most of bikers. It doesn't matter if you're using Mivisi or any other, because like the workers, it is like a historical way of moving in a bike, and they are risking their lives. It's not like the safest place to ride a bike, this city. But even so, people is moving in a bike. So what we do is we are linking, and we are having this alliance and allies also. That's something we need. Allies in different ways. People that are listening to the new agenda, because it is a new agenda. The old cities are awakening, I guess. And young women are giving us the example of what to do and what to look for. And I think that, I don't know, Elliot or Steve, if you have any kind of these numbers, I mean, I know it is super easy to just split the data, right? To know exactly how many women are using your scooters, or how many women, or how old they are, even with seniors, right? We're not taking care of them, or we're not taking care of kids. I know there are some kid projects in South America, in Brazil, I guess. I remember it was in Brazil. And it's beautiful, right? To see that you're also including all citizens, all people, and not only according to what you feel the user is. So you need this data to construct big data and know exactly what you're talking about when you're referring to users. That's what I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other some challenges to communicating findings that you guys have experienced?
Yeah, I guess just briefly, I think this is a very important point, and so I thank you very much, Stephanie, for the question. But the data versus information is like a line that we have to draw often when talking with the city transportation officials who are utilizing our platform to monitor these programs. As I mentioned during my presentation, like even just the very exercise of counting how many scooters are out in the street can be a philosophical one, based on what it is you want to set the bar as for how many vehicles we saw in a day. Now, because we get live status change information that we process on a daily basis, we have a pretty fine-grained view into the operations of these vehicles. However, you could imagine that a city has a cap of 500 vehicles on the street, and so an operator wants to maintain those 500 vehicles. But if vehicles are taken off of line for maintenance or they're on a trip and they're not being reported right then, you know, you can imagine a guy going to a warehouse and picking up 50 new vehicles and driving those to deploy out in the right of way. And while they're being deployed, he's going to go pick up another 50. But for a moment in time, we could have seen 550 vehicles out there, even though it was through the process of switching them out. And so I think the main point for us in trying to make sure cities know what it is they want to hold operators to really come back to having conversations with the cities about what is the intent behind the regulation they have? What outcomes do they want to have? And what is it that they really want to see happen? And then you can try to adjust the metric to get those to those ends. So in the example of vehicle counts, we often provide cities with 4 different ways, or sometimes more, that they could look at vehicle counts. One is we could average the highest number of vehicles we saw every minute, and then take the highest that we saw from the minutes, or we could look at the average number of vehicles we saw over the hour and then take the highest hour, or we could just look at the average number of vehicles deployed throughout the day, or we could do the highest number of vehicles that we see deployed for a subsection of the day, like the core operational hours of the service. And so I think it's that give and take and sort of like an iterative process with the city, and wanting to make sure that we understand what outcomes they're after. You know, if they want to make sure that at no point they never see any vehicle over 500 vehicles, even if it's for maintenance, et cetera, then maybe they want to look at the minute by minute zone. But if they're more, hey, we don't want to just have a ton of vehicles accumulating over the course of the day, but we want to be flexible for operations during the day so that the operators can get their vehicles in and out, then maybe a less stringent metric could be for them. It's really that iterative process with the city, getting them through what information we can extract from the data based on what it is, and not trying to do anything more than that.
Elliot. And Sid, I don't know if you want to also contribute here, kind of talking about the academic perspective, kind of doing research in the academy and then communicating that to the public and to cities.
So yeah, that's one of the important things that we were working on right now. So what the best way that we could do is we were reaching out to the different people we were interviewing all through this process of understanding how the operator's perspective is and how the practitioner's perspective is. So we're trying to bring everything together in a single report, and then we're trying to disperse that report into the city. We had a conversation with the DDOT and Dr. Jonathan Gifford, who has been working on this project. We've been in contact with the Mobility Lab before. And so what we found is that cities are interested in knowing what's happening in terms of where the riders are moving and what. So they have the information from the spatiotemporal data patterns that they're getting from these operators, and also from the data management tools, but they do not really have like a lot of information on what exactly people are thinking about these devices and how they are processing these devices in a post-pandemic environment. So what we were trying to do is we're doing an extended study on this existing scope of harmonization to understand what people exactly are doing in terms of pre and post-pandemic behavior, whether they are inclined towards making cross-border activities or not. And if that is the case, then there is really a need for the cities to have a common dialogue in the way that they're making these decision scorecard weights. And some cities have a different weights for the equity, and for some others have a different weights for the way that the operators are deploying their scooters in different regions of the city. So I think right now, what we were trying to do is trying to connect to every individual city representative to understand and bring their views together, and then try to overlay that along with the user behavior surveys, and then bring it back to the cities.
Thank you. And we're running up on time, so I wanted to thank all the panelists for providing information on what you've been doing recently and how that can hopefully benefit all the participants who are here in this session. And I want to thank you all for coming out as well to the last session. So I hope to see you all in the closing. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks.